And in that regard, there are two keynote speakers who I'd like to introduce, which is Melanie Barbato and Venu Mehta, both of whom are editors of this volume and who are going to give our keynote speech. Melanie Barbato is the author of Jain Approaches to Plurality, Identity as Dialogue with Brill, and the editor of Interreligious Dialogue and Diplomacy, a special issue of Cross Currents with UNC Press. She is a lecturer at RWTH Aachen University in Germany and coordinates the network of Hinduism and Dialogue at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies in the UK. Our second keynote speaker today is Venu Mehta, an assistant professor of Jainism and Comparative Spiritualities at Claremont School of Theology. She specializes in Jainism with a primary focus on Jain regional vernacular, devotional literature, narratives, and practices. Her PhD dissertation investigates the devotion to the Jain goddess Padmavati among the Shvetambar Murtipujak Jains in Gujarat. The title of Dr. Barbato and Dr. Mehta's talk is Anekāntavāda, Jainism and the Future of Comparative Theology. And with that introduction, we warmly welcome you, both Professors Barbato and Mehta. Thank you for speaking today.
Thank you so much. Let me start by sharing my presentation. Okay, is that working?
Perfectly. You just need to.
Okay,
yeah,
great. Thank you. So thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me and more importantly us to be part of this wonderful event. By us, I mean a number of people who are presenting at this conference who are connected to our book at Jainism and Comparative Theology, a multi-religious approach. And my part of the keynote will introduce comparative theology as an academic field and discuss how it can move from a practice rooted in Christianity to a multi-religious enterprise. Comparative theology has developed over the past decades as a way of doing theology that takes religious plurality seriously. In simple terms, it is about engaging more than one religious tradition in order to deepen one's understanding of truth, reality, and one's own commitments. In practice, much of this work has developed within Christian theology. Most typically, it means a Christian theologian reading the text of another tradition in comparison with somewhat similar text from his or her own tradition. Not to convince the other person, but to become him or herself a better Christian by learning from engagement with other traditions. And speaking from my own experience as someone trained in Indology, religious studies, and Catholic theology, learning about Jainism has always been for me enriching on both a professional and a personal level. I first learned about Jainism through the study of texts, but what really shifted my mindset was conversations with Jains in India and around the world. So meeting people really had an impact on my work as an academic. And among the particularly fascinating points for me was the highly developed meta-thinking in Jainism of how different, apparently contradictory positions can be integrated. So for me, the question that I bring to comparative theology is not just how we can do comparative theology about Jainism, but also what a Jain way of doing comparative theology would look like and what we can all learn from this. Maybe at this point, a comment on the word theology is a place. There is one sense in which theology is talking about God, because theos means God. And this is not an activity that fits with Jainism, because Jainism doesn't see our origin or our salvation depending on a God who creates or punishes. But there's another sense in which we can talk about doing theology, and that is drawing on an expression by John Hick when we seek to move from self-centeredness to reality-centeredness. This means when we move from an everyday perspective concerned by getting by or maybe being successful in worldly terms to asking how we can think and live truthfully in relation to ultimate reality. And this is where I think conversations between Jains and non-Jains can happen, transcending the unquestioned level of existence. Is theology the perfect word for that? Certainly not. There have been alternative suggestions like comparative traditions by Brian Dunn, who will also be presenting at this conference today. Someone else recommended to me to do the project as comparative philosophy instead. Still, we kept the word comparative theology here for connecting to an existing field, but mindful that it will have to mean something different in the Jain context than in the Christian context. And in a way, this is exactly the point of this presentation and part of the book. Comparative theology changes when it is done from a Jain perspective. This project grew out of a panel at the comparative theology section at the American Academy of Religion in 2023. At that point, we realized that there had been almost no engagement with Jainism and comparative theology. The only publication we could identify was a reading of the Chilapatikaram by Tracy T. Meyer, and we are very happy that she also agreed to contribute that chapter to this forthcoming book. But at the same time, while there was almost no engagement of Jainism in comparative theology, in other areas, research on Jainism has significantly expanded over the last years, including work on cross-cultural relations and contemporary issues such as animal rights, environmentalism, political polarization. And one milestone in this direction has been the recently published book on engaged Jainism. So congratulations to all who contributed to that. All these issues offer themselves, I think, for interreligious dialogue and comparative theology, because they're some of the most pressing issues of our generation that all faith groups wrestle with. So this raises the question, how can a tradition with such rich philosophical reflection on plurality and contemporary issues still be marginal in the field of comparative theology? I don't know, but our answer is to change that, and we hope that our book will be one small contribution of hopefully many more to come. And already now at this conference, some presenters expand from their chapters in the book to further discussion with Jain thought, so growing the conversation right here at this event. Let me briefly explain comparative theology. Comparative theology is not the same as comparing what different religions do or believe. That field of comparing religions from the outside would be called comparative religion. One of the guiding texts for our book was a text written by Catherine Cornell with the title Comparative Theology, More Than Comparing Theologies. So comparative theology is itself a theological practice, not just a social or cultural science approach that looks what religious people believe. It is often described as faith-seeking understanding in a reference back to Anselm of Canterbury. Comparative theology assumes that other traditions can offer real insights. It tends to work in small steps, often through detailed engagement with specific elements, rather than trying to resolve large questions about truth in general. In practice, this often means a close reading of texts. A scholar reads a text from their own tradition and a text from another tradition and moves back and forth between them in a kind of zigzag pattern that connects them in their language and stories through similar patterns and imagination. The aim is not unusual comparison. It is about deepening understanding and about seeing one's own tradition differently through the encounter with another. A key figure here is Francis Clooney. He describes comparative theology as a process of reading back and forth between texts of different traditions. Typically, one does not come out of this process with a completely different set of beliefs, but with a broader and more nuanced understanding, one that no longer thinks the own without the other. For example, in a book called His Hiding Place is Darkness, he reads a Christian and a Hindu text, both of which are about lamenting God's absence in the experience of the soul, to bring devotional voices of longing for the divine into conversation and see how there's similarity between these traditions that can inform also the theological insight. Clooney's approach has been very influential, and there are now centers and university professors specialized on comparative theology. There are non-Christian comparative theological works, but as a discipline, comparative theology is still mainly done by Christian theologians engaging with non-Christian traditions. This means that the field has largely developed within Christian theological frameworks, And as we saw, for example, a Jain may not have chosen the label comparative theology to start with. The closeness of comparative theology to Christianity has historical reasons. Comparative theology developed out of a long history of Christian engagement with other religions, through trade, mission, translation, intellectual exchange. And the motives of many historical encounters were mixed. Even when conversion was not the goal of such interaction, Christians tended to think of their tradition as superior, and power dynamics were often unequal. Other traditions were respected if they could display communalities with Christianity, a god, a founder, a central sacred text, or a creed. Over time, especially in the 20th century, many Christian churches got humbled. There's a great chapter by Marianne Moyart on how much of European Christianity shifted from conversion to dialogue and from conflict to cooperation. For example, one factor was the First World War, where European Christians killed each other mercilessly, and how that really changed the perception of one's own identity. So such developments led to a major and important change towards respecting religious diversity and seeking a dialogue with other traditions. Comparative theology is the child of an era that prioritizes learning from each other. At the same time, this shift did not remove all asymmetries. Not only theology, but also other academic disciplines still rely on concepts that come out of a specific historical and cultural context of how academia has developed. Like religion, theology, philosophy, God, or sacred texts, these categories are not necessarily wrong, but they structure our way of thinking, and they do not fit all traditions equally. In Europe, for example, there was a historical process towards splitting a public political realm from a private religious realm, and in much of Asian history, this kind of differentiation didn't happen in the same way. The same with the differentiation of religion and philosophy. And so these conceptual boxes cannot be simply transferred from one context to the other. And Jainism is really interesting here. Jainism is one of the oldest living religions. It has a highly developed philosophical literature. It has long reflected on questions of knowledge, truth, and plurality. It has a systematic theory of karma that can be called scientific. It has elements that can be called religious. Although there is not a creator god, we have complex networks of stories, rituals, and practices that involve godly beings in higher realms. And it has the Siddha, the liberated soul that resides on the top of the universe. So the issue, I think, is not whether Jainism is relevant to comparative theology, but the question is what happens when Jainism is taken seriously within comparative theology. My colleague will answer that in a second part of this lecture, so I will instead turn to the more general question of expanding comparative theology into a multi-religious project in line with today's topic of interreligious dialogue. If we look at comparative theology and how it is usually done, we see a common pattern. It focuses on texts of two traditions, and it assumes a single theologian as the one who reads, interprets, and compares. Here I think comparative theology could learn from interreligious studies. Interreligious studies is an interdisciplinary field that brings together people from religious studies, theology, and any field that concerns itself with the way religious traditions interact. In interreligious studies, scholars often also see themselves as scholar practitioners, that is, academics that study dialogue but are also involved in dialogues themselves. Comparative theology is not the same as interreligious dialogue, as Clooney has also pointed out. But comparative theology can, in efforts of navigating future trajectories, orient itself towards some form of interreligious dialogue, such as scriptural reasoning. That is a constructive and intentional encounter between people belonging to at least two different traditions. And there, I think, are other options for calibration within academic fields that might coexist as methodological approaches, but I think this is an important one. The individual theologian would then understand his or herself as an inquiry to another faith community and its sources of knowledge, be that text, narrative, and material culture. This entails a shift away from literature to people, and at the same time a deprioritization of the individual author as an expert and as the locus of comparison. The definitive activity in this approach would not be the reading and internal process of an individual theologian, but the encounter of people from different traditions through the process of theologizing in conversation. Here we made a naturally find an expansion of material from text to aesthetics, from visuals, all things that we can talk about. A publication of comparative theology is three prayers in dialogue, and this I think is very close to a dialogical model that I think would be a great ideal in this practice. So in that article, a Christian, a Muslim, and a Jew read their central prayers in the light of each other. And I'm very grateful to Frank Clooney for pointing this article out to me. And towards the beginning of the article, the authors write as a statement of intent. We identify ourselves as practitioners, not simply as researchers. We provide a living example of comparative theology. We show that there's much of all members of our respective faiths to learn from the other Abrahamic faiths. We show that comparative theology is not only intellectually legitimate, but also particularly valuable in the modern context. We show that within our differences, we can work together. Indeed, our religious commitment gives heightened sensitivity to the conversation. In a different format of collaboration, Muna Tatari and Klaus von Stosch have in their joint book on Mary found a mode and language that allows them to write together with one voice, but at the same time maintaining their identities and commitments as an Islamic and Christian theologian. Rather than exceptions of collaborative success, such projects could be read as setting new standards in comparative theology, in which it is normal to consult and, if desired by both sides, collaborate with the other faith community. This does not mean that all comparative theological articles and monographs should be co-authored. What is more relevant is to integrate on a fundamental level the conviction that religious communities should be part of theologizing that draws on their sacred material. This means that reading and internal reflection are important, but equally important are communication, encounter, and representation. As this is a matter of justice and community building, as much as of good academic practice, I think these are very fitting topics for a conference on engaged Jainism. With these points, I'm handing over to Dr. Venu Mehta for the second part of the keynote lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Melanie Barbato. All right. I would like to continue this conversation by shifting the lens slightly and asking what happens when we approach comparative theology from within a Jain framework. Dr. Barbato has shown us how comparative theology enables learning across traditions. From a Jain perspective, I would suggest that this movement across traditions resonates deeply with a long-standing epistemological orientation, Anekāntavāda, the doctrine of non-one-sidedness. From a Jain perspective, one way of thinking about comparative theology is through Anekāntavāda, the doctrine of non-one-sidedness. Anekāntavāda offers a way of knowing multiplicity that not only recognizes diversity and plurality, but also invites us to engage it with intellectual humility and attentiveness. It suggests that reality is complex and many-sided, and that any single perspective captures only a partial aspect of truth. In this sense, it does not simply affirm that there are many viewpoints. It asks something more of us, to hold our own understanding with care while remaining open to being deepened through encounter with others. And this is where I see a deep resonance with comparative theology, because comparative theology as its best is not about identifying similarities across traditions. It is about entering another tradition seriously, learning from it on its own terms, and then returning to one's own tradition with a transformed understanding. At the same time, Jainism has rarely been at the center of comparative theology. We have seen rich and sustained work in Hindu Christian, Buddhist Christian comparative theology. But Jainism has remained comparatively underrepresented in these conversations. And yet Jain philosophy has long engaged questions that are central to comparative work, such as how to understand plurality, how to account for multiple perspectives on truth, and how to engage difference without collapsing it. It is within this context that this volume, Jainism and Comparative Theology, a multi-religious approach, takes shape. This project brings Jainism into comparative theology, not simply as another tradition to be included, but as a methodological contributor. In other words, Jain thought does not simply participate in comparison, it offers conceptual and philosophical resources that help us think how comparison itself might be practiced. What emerges then is not simply the inclusion of Jainism within an existing field, but an invitation to reconsider how comparative theology itself might be imagined and practiced. This is precisely what I mean when I describe Jainism as a methodological contributor, and when I suggest that this volume is working towards what I have and what we all have been calling an engaged form of Anekāntavāda. That approach is not only articulated conceptually in Jainism, in this volume, Jainism and Comparative Theology, it is built into the very structure of the volume itself. Rather than organizing the volume around a single theological center or one directional model of comparison, the volume brings together multiple religious voices, each speaking from within its own commitment and each engaging Jain thought in distinct yet overlapping ways. What emerges then is not a linear model of comparison, but a field of conversation, as my colleague and co-editor Dr. Barbato explains. We see Jain scholars reading across traditions. We see scholars from other traditions entering into sustained engagement with Jain concepts. And we see essays that moves fluidly between textual analysis, theological reflection, and lived religious experiences. At moments, the conversation converge. At others, they remain productively unresolved. But in each case, they invite a mode of engagement that is attentive, dialogical, and self-reflective. In this sense, the volume does not simply present comparative theology, it performs it. Its structure enacts a dialogical, multiperspectival practice of learning across traditions where difference is neither erased nor resolved, but carefully engaged as a source of insight. Let me now turn briefly to my own chapter as an example of how this method unfolds in practice and in this volume. I begin not in abstraction, but in devotion. With the Jain goddess Padmavati, Padmavati occupies a fascinating place within Jainism. She is neither liberated nor omniscient. She is not a creator figure, yet she is deeply venerated specifically in Gujarat as a protector, a responder, and a maternal presence in devotional life of the Jains. This creates a theological tension. How do we understand a powerful and beloved goddess within a Jain tradition that does not posit a creator deity and remains grounded in karmic framework? It is from within this question that my comparative work begins. From here, I turn to Hindu goddess as portrayed in Charani Shakta poetry, particularly in Isarda's poetry titled Deviyan, which comes from 15th and 16th century in Gujarati language. In this text, the goddess appears in a very different theological register. She is everything. She's not bound by karma. She is the creator, the sustainer, and the destroyer. She is the ground of very existence of human life. She appears as warrior, mother, cosmic force, and source of all being. For me, as a Jain reader, this encounter was not simply comparative, it was transformative because it compelled me to ask, what does it mean that Padmavati is powerful yet not independent in this way? And this is where comparative theology becomes more illuminating. The goal is not to reconcile these two visions, the Shakta goddess as cosmic Shakti and Padmavati as karmically situated, ethically grounded presence. These are not the same. They do not need to be. But placing them in conversation sharpens our understanding, my Jain understanding. Through this contrast, I begin to see more clearly that Padmavati's power lies not in cosmic control, but in relational presence. She does not suspend karma, she accompanies the soul within it. She does not grant liberation, she sustains the condition that makes liberation possible. When I return then to the Jain text, Harsha Sagar's Padmavati Chand, again in the same period of time that the literature comes out, 15th century, late 15th century, and I written differently. What becomes visible is not a diminished form of divinity, but a different theological imagination. Padmavati is invoked as Mata, mother, not as cosmic creator, but as intimate, responsive presence. She protects, but not through domination. She responds without violating karmic law. She embodies virtues like compassion, restraint, clarity, and makes them experimentally available to human. Her divinity lies in her proximity to the laity, to Jain people. For me, this is where the comparative moment becomes most meaningful, because I do not return with a desire to make Padmavati resemble the Shakta or the Hindu goddesses. I return with a deeper appreciation of what it means for her to remain distinctively Jain. This, I would suggest, is what an engaged form of Anekāntavāda looks like in practice. Not the resolution of difference, but learning through it and returning transformed to one's own tradition. What this example suggests then is a broader way of thinking about the relationship between comparative theology and interreligious engagement. Interreligious dialogue often asks a vital and necessary question: how can we live together? Comparative theology, however, asks something slightly different. What can I learn about ultimate reality through a serious engagement with your own tradition? As a Jain perspective adds yet another dimension. It suggests that some learning requires discipline, a willingness to recognize the limits of one's own perspective, and an openness to bring deepened through encounter without dissolving one's own commitments. In this sense, Anekāntavāda is not simply an abstract philosophical principle. It becomes a lived intellectual and theological practice. It calls us not merely to acknowledge plurality, but to engage it with care, attentiveness, and responsibility. And perhaps this is where the work of this volume and the conversation we are part of here becomes especially meaningful. Because what is at stake is not only how we understand one another, but how we allow that understanding to reshape the way we think within our own tradition. So if comparative theology is faith-seeking understanding across traditions, then Anekāntavāda may be understood as a discipline that makes such seeking possible. Thank you. I would like to express my sincere thanks to Dr. Christopher Jane Miller, Dr. Parveen Jain, and Arihanta family for organizing this wonderful conference and for creating such a meaningful space for this dialogue. I'm also deeply grateful to my colleague and co-editor and friend, Dr. Barbato, for this collaboration and for setting the stage so beautifully. And as throughout my slides, you have noticed that my first painting had a different rendition, different textures. That was my Anekāntavāda in picture for you. Which picture was the real picture? Tell us. Thank you.
Thank you both so much, Professors Mehta and Barbato, for kicking us off there with this wonderful keynote talk to really get us thinking through what a Jain comparative theology is. Before we begin, I just want to remind everyone in the audience that we do have a Q&A box. You are welcome to type in that. We do have some questions already rolling in, which is great, and I'll address those in just a moment. And we welcome everyone to do that. I also have been looking through the attendees as you were talking, and we have so many friends here from around the world that all of us know in some way, shape, or form, and we're so glad that you've joined us and are here with us today, and we look forward to participating in this dialogue with you. So thank you, colleagues and friends, for coming. you.